Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Later in the program, global coronavirus trends and international perceptions of U.S. and Chinese leadership. But first, joining us now are Dr. Rocket Ron Epstein of Bank of America Merrill Lynch and Richard Abalafia of the Teal Group Consultancy, two of our team that join us every week for our business roundtable to look at aerospace and defense on world markets. Ron, let me start with you. The Trump administration has decided to ban all Chinese flights to the United States. It's a tit-for-tat move after Beijing said that it would not allow U.S. air carriers to fly to China. U.S. air carriers haven't been flying to China since March because of the pandemic, while Chinese airlines have been servicing America's city. What does all this mean?
I think if you look at what's going on here, the Chinese government wasn't allowing U.S. carriers to fly to China. So it's a little bit of, tit for tat. It's a situation where the U.S. carriers can't go to China, but the Chinese carriers were going to the U.S. So I think, there was some commentary in the press. I think it was Delta actually who said, thank you for, sticking up for us because, for a fair and equal playing field, we should be able to fly to China if the Chinese airlines can fly here.
What are the broader implications of this? What are the impact on the airlines?
At the moment, there's not much. International traffic is way down. If you look at Chinese domestic traffic, it's up, I think, on the order of maybe 45% off the bottom, something like that. But the international flows are at the moment still pretty weak. So at the moment, there's not much of an impact. But I think, bigger picture, this is just yet one other piece in the back and forth in terms of the increasing tension between, Washington and Beijing and the ongoing, if you will call it, the trade spat, the COVID spat. It's just part of that tension.
Richard, how do you interpret this and the impact on both of the airlines, but also air travelers? Because there is a lot of travel. A lot of Chinese Americans live in the United States, whether they're students, folks needed for business to go back and forth. How does this play out?
Yeah, as Ron says, it's really just the big picture issue because in terms of the short-term business opportunities, there really aren't very many, hardly enough to support routes, really. And perhaps not even that. But in terms of, both sides being determined to paint each other as the bad actor in this dispute, and of course to, try to get as much leverage as possible in the context of the trade war, this is another rather bad step. Neither side appears to be showing any interest in compromise or negotiation. You can see how a series of these moves, tit for tat, on and on, just keeps contributing to the deterioration of diplomatic and trade and relations, and possibly worse. But from the standpoint of people traveling between the U.S. and China, it really isn't the end of the world. It's certainly within our recent experience that you had to change planes in Narita or Seoul anyway. So not that much has changed. You can still get there. If you can find a plane to get to Narita, you can get on to China.
Is there any financial impact on Delta and United in the near term, right? No flight, I think the original idea was that, right, didn't the Chinese offer them like sort of one slot per airline, per city, per day or something like that? And then U.S. carriers decided to not fly, right? I think that's what the Chinese are saying as well. You didn't keep flying. We did keep flying to the United States. Is there any sort of clear financial impact on two airlines that have seen their stock go up recently?
From the standpoint of the airlines, there's so little traffic right now, I don't think it matters very much. It's preparing for the hopeful return of traffic in a few months, because of course these direct routes with China were hard won, and of course rather lucrative, like all other good long haul international services are. So if the market comes back and there is, U.S. firms don't have this access that they become accustomed to, yeah, that will hurt. But in the here and now, the opportunity to fly planes that are mostly empty, I'm not so sure it matters given the greater carnage in their financial outlook.
I think the broader issue here is if you look at Boeing, not so much the airlines in the short term, as the tensions rise between the U.S. and China. China is an important customer for Boeing. They're about a third of the backlog for the 737 MAX. They will account for probably about 2 deliveries per month on the 787 at some point. So, if they push off the 787 deliveries and then push off the MAX deliveries, in the current environment, that's meaningful.
So at the end of the day, is this a big deal or not a big deal, right? Because you guys are being very measured and effectively saying, hey, look, there wasn't really a lot of business anyway. So, and there's certainly a hope that this is just a negotiating position and we get to the far side of it. But ultimately, is it a big deal or not a big deal?
Things do continue to get worse in terms of trade relations and overall diplomacy between the U.S. and China. This will be remembered as an important moment on that road downhill. If, however, things recover, if negotiated settlements are reached and tensions resolved, then it will be forgotten. In other words, we'll have to wait a while to figure out just how big a deal this really is.
Ron?
Yeah, I agree with Richard's comments completely. It's time will tell. It's interesting to note, we had a broad rally in the market today in the aerospace stocks on a day where SMBC deferred 68 737 MAXs out to 2025 or beyond. And you got this news on China, right? So there's a lot of stuff swirling around in the market, but I think Richard's dead on right. We'll see ultimately how important this is.
And look, let me just ask you this question, and I know we've been talking about it on the weekly podcast for some time. How is the market trading the way it's trading? Spirit, everybody is up, Boeing is up, and the outlook is still pretty bleak. Ron?
Well, I think the market's trading on what's called this reopening trade, basically. The second derivative. Are things getting better? Yeah. And the real question becomes, folks are trading into cyclicals, stocks that have underperformed relative to the market on, this things are opening up, things are getting better, the second derivative. The real trick's going to be when to get out, right? One of the big debates we've had with investors, not debates, just discussions with investors is, when everything has a price, when is the risk and the opening up, priced into things? But right now, we're in the midst of a pretty meaningful opening up rally, and we saw some of the moves today in the commercial aerospace stocks up, 10 to 20%. Big, meaningful moves for companies with relatively large market caps.
Richard?
I can't help but wonder, and Ron can confirm this or perhaps deny it, but it seems as though a lot of the market is banking on a V-shaped recovery that might be possible, conceivable for the broader economy, but probably not for aviation. Right. And I wonder if they're just not extrapolating, reading across to aviation where it might not be fully appropriate.
I think the market's trying to price in a V-shaped recovery, but the reality is that's probably not what's going to happen. Right. So, that's when the trick really becomes, when do you fade this thing?
Guys, thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Look forward to having you back on over the weekend.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Vago. Great to be here.
Thank you. And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. Joining us now is my friend Daryl Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, one of the world's leading polling firms, who is the co-author with John Ibbotson of the book Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, and his newest book, Next, Where to Live, What to Buy, and Who Will Lead Canada's Future. Daryl, thanks very much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
And I understand that Ontario is going to be potentially under lockdown for a lot longer in the wake of this coronavirus. And that's one of the things that I'd like to get your take on. You are always, and the organization is always looking at global trends from a strategic perspective, especially at this time as policymakers and lawmakers always try to figure out what's next. How is the world dealing with the coronavirus pandemic from your standpoint, given that you're monitoring trends on a global basis?
Well, I think the first point is that we're actually talking about the world, because in most circumstances through history, we didn't really have events that took place on a global scale. Most of them took place within regions or in big sections of the world, but there's always been also significant parts of the world left out. This time around, we're dealing with a truly global phenomena. And the thing that was most interesting is that it took place almost universally, and it took place so instantly. So it's almost like a gigantic social experiment, and particularly in terms of public opinion, about how people will react and adapt to these types of circumstances. So we're learning an awful lot about human behavior and public opinion through this process that I don't think and in any other time we've had as much insight into.
And what are some of the trends that you're seeing within it, right? At the same time, it's a global event. At the same time, we're having folks turning more inward. At the same time, anti or deglobalization pressures. What are some of the trends you're seeing within that set?
Well, the first thing that we saw is that the public's reaction when we went into various forms of social distancing, lockdown, whatever you want to call it, was extreme anxiety. People were very, very worried about what was going on. And we got into that place. And what started to happen was the public started to calm down. And this was a fairly universal type of thing. As people kind of got adapted to and better understood what the disease was about, they started to have a certain amount of more comfort with what they were dealing with. And in fact, they were developing new routines and getting comfortable with those. But what we're seeing now, and as anxiety increases, is as we come back out of this lockdown, people are really anxious about what the new world is going to look like. So that's what many governments are frankly dealing with right now, is how do you manage this process of coming out of lockdown? There was one thing to go into it, it's another thing to come out of it, but both aspects of this, both aspects really do create tremendous anxiety within the public, and that's what we're seeing right now.
And I may have misspoken at the very top, right? I think Ontario remains locked down through the end of June, whereas many employers are asking people to come back in September or the end of September. Am I right about that?
Right, and it's similar to what we're seeing in other countries where people are being told that if they're able to work at home, they should work at home, and essentially what we're being told here, where I am in the city of Toronto as well. But there are other places that have moved further along in the continuum and are coming out more aggressively. Interestingly enough, the United States not really being one of them. If you look at the public opinion environment there, both Canadians and Americans are fairly similar on this, in that they're very worried about what the circumstances of COVID-19 are going to mean for them and their families. Not just from the perspective of health, because in fact, when you go out and you interview people and ask them, do you think you're going to get COVID-19? In most countries, the number's around 30%. The real effect that we're seeing is what people are worried about relative to their own personal prosperity and whether or not they're going to be able to come back into the economy. 90% of the people in Canada and the United States right now think that we're in the midst of a recession, for example. So it may be a physical infection, but the disease for most people appears to be economic.
And where are you seeing, you said that folks are being generally conservative, although the Memorial Day weekend here in the United States was troubling for some, in part because people weren't wearing masks, in part because folks were getting in close proximity. And for many, it was, wow, we worked really hard for the last 2 months. Guys, don't screw it up for everybody. Is there, where are we in this? I mean, do we expect this to surge back? I mean, what are the numbers telling you about where we are in this entire episode?
I'll use Canada as an example because I've seen more data on Canada than just about anywhere else. But and it's similar across most countries. There's a group of about 10% of the population that's just not going to get on board with any of this stuff. They either think that we shut down the economy too much, that we've got to get going again more rapidly than governments are prepared to sanction, that they won't wear masks, they think social distancing is a waste of time, they don't feel they're going to get the disease. Now 10% means that 90% think otherwise, but 10% is still a really big number of
Right.
people. So in the United States, if the population's 330 million, something like that, that's still 3 point whatever it is million of Americans who feel that way, and if they're concentrated in certain places, you're going to see this kind of activity. But the other thing that we're seeing though is that people themselves are leading indicators. So if individuals see that other people are doing practicing certain behaviors, we do tend to follow along. We do tend to follow along. So that's what we're seeing, for example, in the protests in the United States. It doesn't look like social distancing was really on a lot of people's minds. And the reason for that is because if you see other people not doing it, why should you bother? And as I said about how people feel about getting the disease, most people don't feel that they'll get it. Like 70% of the population doesn't feel like they'll get it. So it's kind of a strange mix of all of these things coming together that's creating the situation that we're seeing.
And from your standpoint, what should leaders, whether in government, in organizations, and businesses, take away from the trends you're seeing?
I think that the first thing that I would say to them is that this is something that's going to have to be managed from a behavioral science point of view. You can only do what the public's prepared to accept you doing. And this comes down to businesses. It comes down to governments as well, or educational institutions or whatever. You can open something up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to get people to come back to it and participate in the way that they used to. I would say that there's a whole series of things that have to go along with how the experience in your environment is going to look, what it's going to look like, and communicating that to the public. There's another part, which is making sure that you are enforcing, if you're a government in particular, enforcing the health requirements that you put into place. And next, you have to make it a rewarding thing. So maybe there's some sort of an incentive that has to go into getting people to come back out. But we are very much, behind our doors right now, reluctant to come out, know that we have to, but are very concerned about what the circumstance is going to be. So the more that you can reassure people to get them into the experience and have them go through a couple of successful trials, the easier it will go.
And of course, right, everything is interconnected. So if we don't want to go out, then we're not spending money, we're not traveling. That has economic repercussions. And the butterfly is flapping its wings somewhere, and there's a tsunami happening someplace else.
Right. And the interesting thing when you look at the data on this, Vago, is that it's not like people are saying there's a very distinct order of things that they're willing to do and not willing to do. So there's this perception that there's some low-hanging fruit in terms of opening things up. Not really. People are anxious about everything. There's some things that are seen as bad or as really bad, not as good and bad.
Right.
If you know what I mean. So
yeah.
Going out to a restaurant is still a scary experience to people, but they would see going on an airplane as being a scarier experience.
Right.
And in fact, when you take a look at the likelihood of people planning flights, it's in the single digits right now. It's very, very low.
Wow.
But that doesn't mean that as I said before, there's a whole bunch of things that they're going to do easily. Now, what that says, though, is that there's probably some sort of an order in the way in which you open these things back up. Even if people think it's scary, it's somewhat qualitatively a more understandable experience or an easier to control experience. And that's what people are really looking for. They're looking for places where they know they can control what happened in that place before they got there,
right.
what happens when they do get there. That's what they're really looking for. And by the way, these are universal situations. They're not applicable just to single countries.
Let me take you to security. Every year for one of the world's finest security conferences, which is the Halifax International Security Forum. It's been an honor of mine to participate in that for many years. I know you're also on the committee that puts it on. And one of the things that Ipsos does, and you do, is unveil really a fascinating set of sort of annual security trends. But one of the most interesting things is you guys stay on top of these global security trends and how countries are perceived on a very, very regular basis. Talk to us about how the United States is perceived, how China has been perceived, and what arc are we on? And then, frankly, other parts of the world too, right? I mean, Canada always scores very, very high on that. I think it's not just because Canadian pollsters are doing it. Talk to us about what are some of the broader security trends you've seen in the course of this pandemic and how countries are perceived in the course of it.
Right. So the United States has always been sort of, I would say, middle bracket in terms of how the public, and we usually do this in 28 countries, done it in fewer, but usually around 28, usually is in the bit of the middle bracket in terms of people's belief that they're going to play a positive role in the world. The China tends to be in a bit of a lower bracket. And has typically, we've seen that. But what has happened since the election of President Trump 4 years ago is that the United States has slid down and China has moved up. And the idea that we could potentially have two hegemons in the world was becoming quite real as we were going through the fall. And that was the message that I delivered in Halifax the last time out, which was that Francis Fukuyama's end of history. Well, we may be restarting history because there seems to be another hegemon emerging, particularly for developing markets. They saw China as a bit more of an aspirational challenge to the United States. I would say that COVID has done a very large disservice to China's reputation, and that the effect of that on public opinion is probably quite negative outside of the Chinese nation itself, and has raised a whole bunch of questions about how the Chinese regime operates that people in many countries are going to want to really, I guess, reevaluate maybe the position that they had. That doesn't necessarily mean that the United States is coming up. They're going through a pretty rough patch right now themselves. But I would say China's now taken a bit of a hit and is probably coming back down. Other countries that may be experiencing a bit of a boost would probably be countries like Germany, Canada, Australia, all of them that have come through this crisis a little bit better, but we're always in the very top tier of countries. And you'd see other, the Nordic countries, European countries like France always did pretty well in the survey. But where you see most of the movement, I would say, is in that lower third, and it's usually the United States going up or down, or China going up or down.
One of the before we got started, we were talking a little bit of stuff that's in the news, including rising tensions between the United States and China, and obviously now the spat extending to airlines and airline travel, Chinese limitations on American carriers, America now putting banning all Chinese flights to U.S. cities that have continued sort of unabated through most of the coronavirus. China's view has very much been that it's time to get tough in Hong Kong. It's been saber rattling in Taiwan, and its diplomats have been making it clear that anybody who criticizes China is going to get punished. So we had the beef instance where Australian beef was turned away by China on a pretext to punish Australia after Australia called for a coronavirus investigation. Are any of these factors affecting how China is being broadly seen? Because historically, the Chinese have tried to be at least relatively clever about how they're perceived internationally. How are these sort of more brazen actions playing into perceptions about China?
I would say that the public opinion research, the amount that I've seen, but also anything that we're going to be showing over the course of the next year when we go out and test this, my expectation is that you will see in specific countries where China has decided to play power politics, whether it be Australia or Canada, or pick your country, the United States, that it's had a negative effect on China's reputation in those countries. China was, as I said before, going through, it was kind of rising slowly through the league table as in terms of countries that could provide a positive influence in the world over the space of the last 4 or 5 years. And this last 6 months, I would say, or 8 months, has really not done them any good when it comes to global public opinion. But that may not matter that much to them. The power politics element of this may be more important, but the outcome from playing power politics, whether it's a place like Canada or Australia, as I mentioned before, is that the reputation of China, it will take a hit.
And let me ask you, we've got one more minute left. Let me ask you two brief questions. How have the demonstrations and the George Floyd issue, I know there's going to be, there have been demonstrations also up in Canada about, calling for racial equality. How have these demonstrations affect how the United States is seen? And then I've got one quick follow-up question as well.
Well, since the election of Donald Trump in the United States, the reputation of of your nation has not done particularly well within the world. I don't expect that there's anything that's happened over the space of the last week that would have improved it. If anything, it probably has worsened it. But the question you have to ask is how much worse can it get? It's already at a low ebb compared to, and we've been doing this survey for Halifax for 10 years. We're recording the lowest numbers that we've seen for the United States.
And very briefly, what are the top issues you're looking at so that we have a point of reference to start another conversation, say, in about a month? What are the other trends you're looking at?
Well, there's no other. The Death Star right now is the COVID-19 crisis. It's just blocked out the sun. But what we're seeing, the other effect though, is what it's changed in terms of the issues at a lower tier. So previously, you would see health would be very big on the list, or the environment would be very big on the list. What's happened is economic issues have risen along with COVID, which demonstrates again that for most people, this is the outcome of COVID is not necessarily fear about their health, but fear about the prosperity.
Darryl, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Hope you, yours, and your team stay well, and look forward to having you back on again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Vago.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and LinkedIn, and check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.